What does a woman do when the world has left her for dead? When the only roof is a leaky shack in the heart of the Arizona territory, and the only sound is the growl of a coming thunderstorm that sounds an awful lot like the men hunting her. For Elara Hayes, the world had shrunk to 4 crumbling walls and a pain that ripped through her body with the certainty of a lightning strike. She was about to bring a new life into this unforgiving world, utterly and completely alone. Or so she thought. Because sometimes when a storm comes to take everything you have, it brings something too. Sometimes it brings a ghost of a man, a drifting cowboy, with eyes that have seen too much death, and a coat big enough to wrap around the beginning of a new world. The air in the tiny line shack was thick enough to drink. A hot, soupy mixture of dust pine resin and the metallic tang of fear. Outside, the Arizona sun beat down on the parched earth like a blacksmith's hammer on an anvil, forging the day into a shimmering, breathless ordeal. For Elara Hayes, each wave of heat was matched by a wave of a different kind, a brutal coiling agony that started deep in her back and clenched her belly into a knot of iron. She pressed her forehead against the rough-hewn wood of the wall, the splinters a welcome distracting pain. Her knuckles were white where she gripped the edge of the crude cot. Another contraction seized her, stealing her breath and blurring the dusty sunbeams, slanting through the cracks in the wall into a kaleidoscope of misery. She choked back a cry, biting her lip until she tasted blood. Crying was a luxury. Noise was a danger. It had been 3 days since she'd seen another soul. 3 days since she'd spurred her exhausted mare Daisy to this abandoned dot on a forgotten map, a place her husband Thomas had told her about in whispered, urgent tones. If anything ever happens, Elara. If my father, he never finished the sentence. He didn't have to. Thomas was gone now, buried 6 weeks past. A ranching accident, they'd called it. A spooked horse, a tragic fall. But Elara had seen the look in her father-in-law's eyes at the funeral. Elias Blackwood was a man who didn't believe in accidents, only in outcomes he had personally arranged. He was a cattle baron who ruled his vast holdings with a will of iron and a heart of stone, and he had despised her from the moment Thomas brought her home. She was a schoolteacher's daughter with calloused hands from gardening, not a pedigree from a rival dynasty. But she carried the one thing Elias Blackwood now coveted above all else, his grandchild, his heir, the continuation of the Blackwood line, and he would stop at nothing to possess it. She'd overheard his sons Caleb and Aaron talking in the stables. Father wants the babe the moment it's born. The girl is disposable. That was all she needed. With what little money she had and a small sack of provisions, she had fled in the dead of night. Now the provisions were nearly gone, and Daisy was grazing fitfully in the small hidden box canyon behind the shack. And the baby was coming. It was coming with the brutal inevitability of the thunderstorm now gathering on the horizon, its dark belly rumbling in a low, menacing growl. Elara pushed herself off the wall, her calico dress, once a pretty blue, now stained with sweat and grime. She looked around the small single room. A stone hearth, a broken chair, the cot. It was a pathetic fortress against the forces gathering to claim her. She had a small knife, a half-empty canteen, and the fierce, primal instinct of a mother protecting her young. As the afternoon bled into a bruised purple twilight, the storm broke its leash. The wind came first, a low moan that rattled the shack's loose planks. Then the rain, not in gentle drops, but in thick, angry sheets, that hammered the sod roof. Thunder cracked directly overhead, a deafening explosion that made the very floorboards vibrate. In the blinding flash of lightning that followed, she saw the world outside turn into a chaotic, silver-etched nightmare. And in that flash, another pain, sharper and more insistent than any before, tore through her. It was a searing, splitting agony that dropped her to her knees. This was it. There was no more waiting, no more hoping for a miracle. Her world narrowed to the cot, the thin blanket, and the fight. The storm outside was a symphony of chaos, but inside there was only the rhythm of her own ragged breaths and the primal, all-consuming work of labor. She was an island in a roaring ocean, a solitary actress in the most terrifying and sacred of dramas. Hours blurred. The pain was a living thing, a predator with claws and teeth. She cried out now, her voice swallowed by the thunder. Who was there to hear? The wind. The spirits of whatever desperate souls had sheltered here before her. With one final desperate push that felt like it was tearing her in two, a new sound joined the cacophony of the storm. It was a thin, reedy wail, a cry of life, fragile yet defiant, sobbing with exhaustion and a relief so profound it felt like grief. Elara reached down. A baby, a small, slippery, perfect baby. She pulled the infant to her chest, shielding its wet new skin from the chill. She lay there, trembling, listening to the small, hiccuping cries against the backdrop of the raging storm. She had done it. She had delivered her baby. Alone. She had won. But as she lay there, a new sound cut through the howl of the wind. A sound that wasn't thunder, wasn't rain, wasn't the cry of her newborn. It was the creak of a floorboard near the door. Her blood ran cold. She froze, her heart hammering against her ribs, every muscle tensed. It couldn't be. Not now. Not after everything. Slowly her eyes adjusted to the gloom. A figure stood in the doorway, a tall, broad silhouette against the storm-lashed landscape. Rain dripped from the brim of a low-pulled hat. A long oilskin duster clung to his frame, making him seem even larger, more menacing. He was a spectre conjured from the storm itself. He had made no sound. He had entered like a whisper. He was a hunter. Elara's mind screamed. Caleb Aaron. Had they found her? She clutched her baby tighter, a useless protective gesture. She reached for the small knife beside the cot, her fingers clumsy and weak. This was it then, the end of her short, desperate flight. They would take her baby, and she would be disposable. The figure took a slow step forward, his boots making a soft, squelching sound on the wet floor. Lightning flashed again, illuminating his face for a stark, terrifying second. He was a stranger. His face was lean, etched with lines of hardship. She knew all too well. A dark scruff covered a square jaw, and his eyes. In that brief, brilliant flash, his eyes held not the cruel avarice of a Blackwood, but a look of profound, soul-deep shock. He had seen her. He had seen the baby. And he was just standing there, a ghost in the rain, watching the end of her world. The man's name was Cole. Not that it mattered to the terrified woman on the cot. To her, he was just a shape that had coalesced out of the screaming darkness, a threat made manifest. He saw the glint of the knife in her trembling hand, the wild, cornered animal look in her eyes. He saw the tiny, wailing bundle clutched to her chest. He held up his hands slowly, palms open. It was a gesture he'd used 100 times before calming, spooked horses, facing down men with twitchy trigger fingers. "Easy now, ma'am," he said, his voice a low rumble, rough from disuse, but deliberately gentle. "I mean you no harm." The wind howled, trying to snatch his words away. He'd been tracking a small herd of mustangs for 2 days, hoping to sell them in Prescott, when the storm had descended with a fury he hadn't seen in years. The light from the shack had been a faint, flickering promise of shelter. He'd expected an old prospector, maybe a fellow drifter. Not this. Not a scene of such raw, desperate life. Elara didn't move. Her fear was a physical presence in the room, as palpable as the damp chill. "Who are you?" she demanded, her voice hoarse, cracking with the strain of childbirth and terror. "Did they send you? They—" Cole took another careful step inside, letting the crude wooden door swing shut behind him, muting the storm's roar to a sullen growl. "Ma'am, I don't know who they are. My name is Cole. I was just looking for a dry spot to wait out this devil's own squall." He looked at the scene before him, and something deep inside him, a part of him he thought long dead and buried, stirred. The woman was pale, clearly exhausted and losing blood. The baby, slick and new, was shivering, its cries growing weaker. The air was cold, dangerously cold for a newborn. He knew, with a gut-wrenching certainty, that without warmth and care, the fragile life that had just begun would be extinguished before the sun rose. This was the kind of moment he'd spent the last 5 years running from. A moment where a choice had to be made. A moment where life and death hung in a delicate, trembling balance. His past was a gallery of such moments, most of them ending in failure and regret. "You need a fire," he said, his tone shifting from placating to practical. "And that babe needs to get warm and dry. Now." Elara flinched as he moved not towards her, but towards the stone hearth. He shrugged off his heavy, rain-soaked duster, the oilskin making a soft, crinkling sound. Underneath he wore simple worn clothes and a gun belt that hung on his lean hips with familiar ease. He didn't reach for the Colt Peacemaker, holstered there, a fact that registered somewhere in the back of Elara's terrified mind. Instead, he unstrapped his bedroll and pulled out a dry woolen blanket. "Here," he said, holding it out. "For the child." She stared at the blanket, then at his face. His eyes were a startlingly clear grey, the colour of a dawn sky after a storm. They were weary, filled with a sadness that seemed ancient, but they held no malice. She saw no lie in them. Her own desperation was a more immediate threat than this stranger. Her baby let out another feeble cry, a sound that lanced through her heart. She had to choose. Trust a ghost from the storm, or watch her child perish. With a shaky hand, she gestured for him to place the blanket on the edge of the cot. He did so, maintaining a respectful distance. While she fumbled to wrap the infant in the thick, dry wool, Cole turned his attention to the hearth. He had a small tinderbox in his saddlebags, but for now, he made do with what was there. He found a few pieces of dry wood stashed in a corner, whittled some fine shavings with his pocket knife, and using a flint and steel from his own pouch, patiently struck sparks until a tiny flame flickered to life. He worked with an economy of motion that spoke of long years spent in the wilderness. He was competent, capable. He fed the small flame, nurturing it, until it grew into a steady, crackling fire that began to push back the oppressive damp and gloom. The warm orange light filled shack, casting dancing shadows on the walls. It felt like the first sunrise after a long, dark night. Elara watched him, her grip on her knife loosening slightly. He hadn't asked her name, hadn't asked why she was here, alone and in labor. He had simply seen a need and met it. He stood up, dusting his hands on his trousers. "There's jerky and some hardtack in my saddlebag, if you've got the stomach for it. And a canteen with clean water." He looked from her to the now swaddled baby. "He needs to eat." "Do you?" He trailed off, a flicker of awkwardness crossing his features. The question hung in the air. Elara, despite her exhaustion, felt a flush of heat rise to her cheeks. She nodded, pulling the blanket-wrapped bundle closer. "I know what to do." "Good," he said, turning to give her a measure of privacy. He walked to the far side of the shack and stared out a grimy pane of glass, presenting her with his back. "I'll just watch the rain." In that small gesture of decency, Elara's fear finally began to recede, replaced by a wave of bone-deep weariness. The man Cole was right. Her baby needed to eat. As she guided the newborn to her breast, the world outside the black woods, the chase, all of it, faded away. There was only the warmth of the fire, the solid presence of the stranger's back, and the miraculous tugging sensation of her child nursing. A son. She had a son. After a few minutes, Cole spoke, his voice still directed at the window. "The storm's letting up. It'll pass by morning." He turned slightly, his gaze falling on the cot. "You're safe for the night, ma'am. I'll take the floor by the door. You get some rest." Elara looked at her son, his tiny face peaceful in sleep, his mouth still damp. She looked at the crackling fire, a beacon of warmth and life. And she looked at the tall, quiet man who had walked in from the heart of the storm, and instead of bringing death, had held the darkness at bay. "Elara," she said, her voice barely a whisper. He turned fully, his grey eyes meeting hers across the room. "Ma'am, my name is Elara, and this is Thomas." She named him after his father, a small, defiant act of remembrance. The man Cole gave a slow, solemn nod. "Elara," he repeated, as if committing it to memory. "Thomas." He didn't offer a smile, but the hard lines of his face seemed to soften in the firelight. He laid his saddle down as a pillow near the door and wrapped himself in his damp duster, his hand resting near the butt of his pistol. Sleep for Elara was not a gentle descent. It was a cliff she fell from, a deep, dreamless void of utter exhaustion. But for the first time in months, it was not the sleep of the hunted. The fire crackled. The rain softened to a gentle patter on the roof, and across the room a stranger kept watch. For one night at least, she was not alone. Dawn broke clean and sharp. The storm had scoured the sky, leaving it a pale, pristine blue. The air smelled of wet sagebrush and damp earth. Cole was already awake, crouched by the fire, nursing a tin cup of coffee brewed from his own meager supplies. The aroma filled the small cabin, a comforting, civilized smell, in a place that had known only desperation. He watched Elara as she stirred. She looked younger in the morning light, but the shadows under her eyes told a story of hardship that went far beyond a single night of labor. She checked on the baby first, her hand resting on the small blanket-wrapped form with a tenderness that made something ache in Cole's chest. "He's warm," she said, her voice filled with wonder. "He slept through the morning." "That's good," Cole said, rising to pour a second cup of coffee. He held it out to her. "It's not much, but it's hot." She accepted it with a grateful nod, her fingers wrapping around the warm tin. They sat in silence for a few moments, the quiet crackle of the fire, the only sound. The fragile peace of the morning felt like a borrowed thing. Something that could be snatched away at any moment. "You saved us," Elara said, looking at him over the rim of her cup. "The fire, the blanket. We wouldn't have made it through the night." Cole just shrugged his gaze, fixed on the flames. Anyone would have done the same. "No," she said softly, but with a firm certainty. "Not anyone." She paused, gathering her courage. "You asked last night who they were. You deserve to know what kind of trouble you've sheltered." And so the story spilled out of her. She told him about her late husband, Thomas, and his powerful, possessive father, Elias Blackwood. She described the Blackwood Ranch less a home and more a fortress, a sprawling empire built on cattle land and the intimidation of smaller homesteaders. She told him of Elias's chilling pronouncement that the baby was Blackwood property and the overheard conversation that had sent her fleeing into the wilderness. As she spoke the name Blackwood, she saw Cole stiffen. It was a subtle, almost imperceptible change, but the stillness in him became absolute. His grey eyes, which had been watchful but calm, hardened into chips of flint. He didn't look at her. He stared into the fire, as if seeing ghosts in the embers. "Elias Blackwood," he said, his voice flat and devoid of emotion. "Of the B-Bar B Ranch down near the Tularosa Basin." It wasn't a question. "Yes," Elara whispered, a new fear trickling into her veins. "Do you know him?" Cole was silent for a long moment. The warmth of the morning seemed to drain from the room. When he finally spoke, his voice was laced with an old, cold bitterness. "I know of him. I was a Texas Ranger once. 5 years ago, we were tasked with settling a boundary dispute near the basin. A lot of small ranchers were being forced out, their claims jumped, their wells poisoned. All trails led back to the B-Bar B, but there was never any proof. Elias Blackwood has a long reach. He buys lawmen and buries secrets." He finally turned to look at her, and the sadness she'd seen before was now eclipsed by a grim resolve. "My partner, a young ranger named Frank Peterson, was getting close to finding that proof. He was a good man, had a wife and a baby girl on the way. He was found at the bottom of a canyon. Riding accident, they called it." The echo of the phrase hung in the air between them. A ranching accident, a riding accident, the Blackwood signature. "I couldn't prove it was Blackwood," Cole continued, his voice low and tight. "The investigation was shut down from on high. I saw the rot, the corruption he spread. I turned in my badge and I walked away. I haven't been back to that part of the territory since." Elara stared at him, understanding dawning in her eyes. This was no coincidence. Fate, or something like it, had sent her a man who was not just a drifter, but a man who had his own ghosts, his own score to settle with the very family that hunted her. Their shared enemy was a chain binding them together in the desolate quiet of the shack. "So you see," she said, her voice trembling slightly, "they won't stop. Caleb Thomas's brother, he's just like his father. He'll be leading the search. He'll track me to the ends of the earth." As if her words had summoned him, Cole, who had been absently scanning the landscape through the doorway, suddenly went rigid. He raised a hand for silence, his head cocked. "What is it?" Elara whispered. "Get away from the door," he commanded, his voice a low, urgent hiss. He moved with the fluid grace of a predator, pulling his Colt from its holster. The click of the hammer being cocked was deafening in the silence. He peered around the edge of the doorframe, his body flattened against the wall. Elara's heart pounded. She scrambled to the back of the shack, shielding her son with her body, her eyes wide with terror. After a long, tense moment, Cole eased the hammer down and holstered his weapon. "Riders," he said grimly. "3 of them, on the ridge to the east, moving fast." "Can they see the shack?" "Not yet. It's tucked in pretty good, but they're following your tracks from before the rain washed them out. They're good trackers. They'll find this place by midday for sure." He looked at her, his expression grim. "That's a Blackwood posse, I'd wager my life on it." The borrowed peace was shattered. The hunt was on again. "What do we do?" Elara asked, her voice shaking. Cole was already in motion, his mind working with a cold, clear purpose that had been dormant for 5 years. The ranger was back. "We run," he said, kicking dirt over the fire to extinguish it. "But we don't run blind. The land to the south is flat open. They'd run us down in an hour. We head north into the broken country. The canyons and rocks will give us cover. It'll be harder riding, but it's our only chance." He strode over to her. "Can you ride?" he asked, his gaze searching her face for any sign of weakness. The question was absurd. She had just given birth less than 12 hours ago. Her body was a wreck of aches and exhaustion, but as she looked at her sleeping son, she found a strength she didn't know she possessed. She thought of Caleb Blackwood's cruel face, of Elias's cold, dead eyes. "Yes," she said, her voice clear and strong. "I can ride." "Good," Cole said, a flicker of admiration in his eyes. "Get ready. We leave in 5 minutes." The chase had begun, and their only hope was to disappear into the harsh, unforgiving wilderness before the shadow of the Blackwood name fell over them for good. The next 2 days were a blur of rock, sun, and fear. The broken country was a brutal sanctuary. They rode through narrow, winding canyons where the sun barely reached their horses' hooves, echoing off the stone walls. They scrambled over rocky mesas that offered breathtaking views of the vast, empty land and the terrifyingly persistent dust cloud of their pursuers, always miles behind, but always there. Cole was a master of the wilderness. He found paths that weren't on any map, watering holes, hidden in shaded alcoves, and ways to cover their tracks that baffled and delayed the posse. He was tireless, his senses on a knife's edge. He moved with the grim purpose of a man not just fleeing, but leading a strategic retreat. For Elara, it was an ordeal beyond imagining. Every jolt of the saddle was a fresh agony. She rode with baby Thomas, strapped to her chest in a makeshift sling Cole had fashioned from a blanket. Her entire being was focused on 2 things: staying on her horse and protecting her son from the relentless sun and jolting ride. She ate Cole's jerky without tasting it, drank from his canteen when he pressed it into her hands, and drew on a reservoir of maternal strength that seemed bottomless. On the evening of the 2nd day, they stopped in a narrow defile, their horses and themselves hidden from view. The baby was fretful, his cries small and weak. A feverish heat radiated from his little body. "He's sick," Elara said, her voice ragged with panic. "He needs a doctor. He needs medicine." Cole touched the baby's forehead with the back of his fingers. His expression was grave. "You're right. He's burning up. We can't keep on like this." He pulled out an old, creased map from his saddlebag, studying it in the fading light. "There's a town," he said, pointing a finger at a small dot. "Harmony Creek. It's another day's ride northeast. Small place. A mining town, mostly. It's a risk. The Blackwoods might have men there." Elara's eyes lit with a desperate hope. "Harmony Creek," she breathed. I know someone there, an old friend of my father's, Dr. Abram Calloway. My father helped him set up his practice years ago. He's a good man. He'll help us." Cole looked at her, weighing the options. A doctor they could trust was a godsend, a chance they couldn't afford to ignore. But walking into a town was like walking into a trap. Still, the baby's labored breathing made the decision for him. "All right," he said. "We ride for Harmony Creek at first light." They arrived on the outskirts of the town late the next afternoon, looking like wraiths. They were covered in dust, gaunt and exhausted. Harmony Creek was a single dusty street, lined with a dozen or so wooden buildings, a saloon, a general store, a blacksmith, and a small building with a neatly painted sign that read, "Dr. Abram Calloway, Physician and Surgeon." Hope, fierce and bright, surged in Alara's chest. "You wait here with the horses," Cole said, his voice low. "Stay in the shadows of this livery. I'll go in first. Scout things out. See if the good doctor is as good as you remember." Alara nodded, her knuckles white as she clutched her reins. She watched Cole stride across the street, his duster swirling around his boots. He didn't look like a man seeking aid. He looked like a lawman walking into a showdown. He disappeared inside the doctor's office. The minutes stretched into an eternity. Alara tried to soothe the baby, whose cries were now distressingly weak. Every person who walked down the street seemed to stare at her, their eyes filled with suspicion. The town wasn't harmonious. It was tense, watchful. Finally, the door to the doctor's office opened. Cole appeared and gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod. It was the signal. Relief washed over Alara so intensely she felt dizzy. She slid from Daisy's back, her legs nearly buckling, and hurried across the street, clutching her precious son. The inside of the office was cool and smelled of carbolic acid and herbs. It was clean and orderly. A man in his late 50s, with kind, tired eyes and spectacles perched on his nose, rose to greet her. "Alara," he said, his voice soft. "My child, I heard you were. I'm so glad to see you're safe." It was Dr. Calloway. Tears sprang to Alara's eyes. "Abram, thank God. My baby, he's so sick." The doctor immediately took charge, his professional demeanor taking over. He gently took baby Thomas from her arms and laid him on an examination table, his hands deft and gentle. "A fever, yes. Let's have a look." Cole stood by the door, his hand never straying far from his Colt, his eyes scanning the street outside the window. He trusted Alara's judgment, but he didn't trust the town. He'd seen two men at the saloon, rough-looking types, watching his entrance with too much interest. Dr. Calloway worked quickly, sponging the baby with cool water, preparing a small dose of medicine. He's dehydrated, exhausted, but he's a strong boy. With some rest and proper care, he'll pull through. You can stay here in the back room. You'll be safe. The offer was everything they had prayed for. A sanctuary. A haven. Alara could have wept with gratitude. As the doctor was measuring out a powder into a small glass of water, there was a heavy knock on the front door. Everyone froze. Dr. Calloway's face went pale. He looked from the door to Cole, then to Alara, his eyes wide with fear. "Who is it, Doc?" Cole asked, his voice a low growl. "Just a patient," the doctor stammered, his hands trembling so badly he nearly dropped the glass. I'll send them away." But Cole had seen the look of pure terror on the man's face. He moved to the window, peering through a crack in the curtains. His body went tense. Outside, the two rough-looking men from the saloon were standing on his porch, and just behind them, dismounting from a big black stallion, was a man whose face Cole would never forget from the wanted posters. It was Caleb Blackwood, his expression a mask of cruel satisfaction. Cole turned from the window, his eyes cold as ice. He looked at the trembling doctor. "You sent word," he said. "It wasn't a question. You sent a telegraph, didn't you?" Dr. Calloway crumpled his face, ashen. "They came here yesterday," he whispered, his voice breaking. "Blackwood's men. They said they were looking for you, Elara. They described you. They said if anyone helped you, they would burn this town to the ground. My wife, my children. They live here." The betrayal was a stunning physical blow. The haven was a trap. The good, kind man from her memory had been twisted by fear into a tool of her enemies. "Get her and the baby into the back room." Cole snarled at the doctor, grabbing his arm in a vice-like grip. "Now, and if you make a sound, I will end you before they get through that door." Shaking with sobs, the doctor helped Elara, who was numb with shock, into the small adjoining room. Cole pushed a heavy bookshelf in front of the connecting door, barricading them in. He turned to face the front door, pulling his Colt. The heavy, confident footsteps of Caleb Blackwood echoed on the porch. The knock came again, harder this time, more of a command. The friendly doctor's office had become a cave. The treacherous haven was about to become a battleground. And Cole stood alone between a desperate mother, a sick child, and the full murderous wrath of the Blackwood clan. "Dr. Calloway!" Caleb Blackwood's voice boomed through the door, a sound of arrogant authority. "We know she's in there. My men saw the drifter go in, then the woman. Open this door, or we'll open it for you." In the back room, Elara clutched her son, her body trembling. The brief, beautiful dream of safety had turned into her worst nightmare. She listened to the doctor's terrified whimpers from the other side of the bookshelf. Betrayal was a bitter, acidic taste in her mouth. Cole ignored the voice at the door. He was a whirlwind of quiet, deadly motion. He moved to the back of the small office, to a single window that looked out over a narrow, refuse-strewn alley. He tested the sash. It was stiff, but it opened. He turned to the barricaded door of the back room. "Elara," he said, his voice low but urgent, cutting through the doctor's pathetic sniffling. "Listen to me. There's no fighting our way out to the front. We go out the back window." "They'll hear us," she whispered back, her voice tight with panic. "Maybe," Cole conceded. "But it's the only chance we have. Get ready to move." He looked around the room, his eyes calculating angles, seeking advantages. His gaze fell on a large glass cabinet filled with medical instruments and bottles. An idea desperate and dangerous formed in his mind. He strode to the front door. "Just a moment," he called out, pitching his voice to sound nervous like the doctor's. He rattled the doorknob. It's stuck." Outside, Caleb laughed, a harsh, grating sound. "Don't play games, old man. You have 10 seconds. Cole didn't need 10 seconds. He braced his shoulder against the heavy oak of the examination table, and with a single powerful heave, sent it crashing into the glass instrument cabinet. The sound was apocalyptic, a tremendous explosion of shattering glass and splintering wood that echoed through the small building. "Now!" Cole yelled and sprinted for the back window. The crash served 2 purposes. It created a momentary shocking diversion, and it would make Caleb and his men think a struggle had already begun inside. They would likely try to storm the front, giving Cole and Elara a few precious seconds. He threw his leg over the windowsill and dropped into the alley, landing in a crouch. He immediately turned, holding his arms up for the baby. Elara was right behind him. her face a mask of determination. She passed the feverish, whimpering Thomas into Cole's steady hands, then scrambled through the window herself, tearing her dress on a nail, but not making a sound. "This way," Cole hissed, already moving. They ran. Down the alley past overflowing trash bins and startled rats. They could hear shouting from the street, the splintering crack of a boot kicking in the doctor's front door. They didn't look back. They rounded a corner past the back of the blacksmith's forge, the smell of coal smoke and hot iron filling the air. Their horses were still tied at the livery, but going for them was suicide. They were on foot, exposed. They darted between two buildings and found themselves in a small, deserted stable yard. A lone wagon, loaded with barrels of what smelled like salted fish, stood hitched to two sturdy-looking draft horses. The driver was nowhere in sight, likely drawn by the commotion. It wasn't a choice. It was an instinct. Cole tossed the baby gently up to Alara on the wagon seat, then untied the reins with a slash of his knife. He slapped the lead horse hard on the rump. "Higher!" The heavy horses, startled, lurched forward. The wagon groaned and rumbled out of the yard, turning onto a side street that led away from the town's center. It was a clumsy, conspicuous escape vehicle, but it was better than their own 2 feet. As they clattered down the street, Alara looked back. She could see Caleb Blackwood and his 2 thugs spilling out of the doctor's office, looking around in confusion. One of them pointed in their direction. The hunt was back on, and their lead was measured in seconds. They urged the lumbering horses on the wagon, bouncing violently on the rutted track leading out of town. "They'll be on their horses in minutes," Alara cried over the rumble of the wheels. "They're faster than this wagon." "I know," Cole yelled back, his eyes scanning the terrain ahead. "We just need to make it to the river." He pointed towards a line of cottonwood trees in the distance. They abandoned the wagon near the riverbank, scrambling down a steep, muddy embankment into the thick reeds and brush. Cole found a shallow spot, and they waded into the cold, fast-moving water, using the overgrown riverbank as cover. They moved downstream, the frigid water soaking them to the bone, but also washing away their scent and tracks. They finally collapsed hours later in a thicket of willows miles from Harmony Creek as dusk began to settle. They were soaked freezing and utterly spent. Baby Thomas was still feverish, his small body shivering violently against Alara's. The medicine the doctor had almost given them was a world away. "We can't stop," Alara sobbed, her spirit finally beginning to break. "They'll find us. It's hopeless. They will take my son." She clutched at the small silver locket around her neck, a nervous habit she'd had since the funeral. It was the only thing she had left of her husband. Cole watched her, his own exhaustion a heavy weight. He had failed. He had led them into a trap and barely gotten them out alive. The feeling of regret, the one he had tried to outrun for 5 years, was closing in on him again. "What is that?" he asked, his voice rough. He nodded at the locket. "You're always holding it." "It was Thomas's," she said, her voice thick with grief. "A wedding gift. It has his picture inside." "Let me see it," Cole said, a strange intensity in his voice. Confused, Alara fumbled with the clasp and handed it to him. It was a simple, elegant silver oval. Cole took it, his big, calloused fingers, surprisingly nimble. He didn't look at the picture. He turned it over and over, feeling its weight, examining the hinge. "My pa was a watchmaker," he said quietly as if to himself. "Taught me to look for things people hide. Seams that aren't quite right. A little too much weight on one side." Using the tip of his knife, he pressed firmly on a tiny, almost invisible seam on the side of the locket, opposite the hinge. There was a faint click. The back of the locket, the side that rested against her skin, sprang open. It was a false back. Tucked inside, folded into a tiny, tight square, was not another picture, but a piece of paper. Cole carefully unfolded it. It was covered in Thomas Blackwood's familiar, neat handwriting. Elara leaned closer, her breath catching in her throat. "What is it?" Cole's grey eyes scanned the document, his expression shifting from curiosity to disbelief, and then to a slow, dangerous smile. It was the first time she had seen him smile. It was not a pleasant sight. It was the smile of a man who had just been handed a loaded gun in a knife fight. "Elara," he said, his voice a low, triumphant growl. "This isn't just a locket. It's a confession, and a last will and testament." He read from the paper. "I, Thomas Blackwood, being of sound mind, do hereby declare that my father Elias Blackwood was directly responsible for the illegal seizure of the Peterson homestead, and for the subsequent death of Texas Ranger Frank Peterson." Cole looked up at her, his eyes blazing with a fire she had never seen before. "He names the men his father paid. He details the land grabs. And," he took a deep breath, "he leaves everything, his entire share of the Blackwood ranch and fortune, not to his father, but solely to my beloved wife, Elara, and our unborn child." Elara stared dumbfounded. It was all there. Proof of his father's crimes. The weapon that could destroy Elias Blackwood. And the legal document that made her son not just an heir to be stolen, but the rightful owner of a dynasty. Thomas in his final days had given her more than just a memory. He had given her a sword. "This," Cole said carefully, refolding the paper and tucking it into the most secure pocket of his worn leather vest, "changes everything. We're done running from them, Elara." He looked out into the growing darkness in the direction of the men who were hunting them. "Now we start hunting them." They didn't run anymore. They moved with a new, cold purpose. Cole was no longer a man escaping a past. He was a ranger again, preparing his battlefield. The document in his vest was more powerful than any gun. It wasn't just about survival anymore. It was about justice. A justice 5 years overdue. "Caleb will expect us to keep heading north towards the territories," Cole reasoned as they huddled over a tiny, smokeless fire. "He'll think we're running scared, trying to lose ourselves in the wilderness. We're not going to do what he expects." He drew a map in the dirt with a stick. "We're going back. South. Straight towards the Blackwood Ranch." Elara looked at him, her initial shock replaced by a dawning understanding. "Into the lion's den." "Lions get predictable when they think they've won," Cole said grimly. "Caleb is arrogant. He's angry we slipped through his fingers in Harmony Creek. He'll push his men and his horses hard. He'll be chasing ghosts heading north while we circle back behind him." Their target was a place called Sentinel Rock, a tall, lonely butte that overlooked the main trail leading to the Blackwood Ranch. It was a natural choke point. From its heights, 2 people could hold off 20 if they knew what they were doing. And Cole knew exactly what he was doing. The journey south was a masterpiece of stealth. They traveled by night and rested during the day, their path a winding, intelligent course through the most difficult terrain. Elara's strength had returned, with a vengeance fueled by the hope in Thomas's final letter. Her son nourished by a new medicine of herbs, Cole knew how to find and prepare, was growing stronger too. His fever had broken his cries, replaced by the quiet gurgles of a contented infant. They reached the base of Sentinel Rock 2 days later, well ahead of the returning posse. The climb was arduous, leading the horses as far as they could before securing them in a hidden cleft, then carrying their supplies the rest of the way on foot. The summit was a flat, wind-swept expanse of stone littered with boulders that made for perfect cover. It provided a commanding 360-degree view of the surrounding plains. They had one rifle Cole's Winchester, his Colt and Ilara's small knife. Their ammunition was limited. This wouldn't be a prolonged siege. It would be a battle of wits and nerve. "They'll be here by morning," Cole said, scanning the northern horizon. "Caleb will be furious when he realizes he's been chasing the wind. He'll ride back this way, hard and fast, and he won't be paying attention." That night, there was no fear between them. A strange sense of calm had settled over Ilara. She watched Cole as he checked his rifle, his movements precise and economical. He was a man who had found his purpose again, dragged back into the light by her and her son. They were a strange, battered little family, brought together by violence and grief, preparing for one final reckoning under the vast, star-dusted sky. "Cole," she said softly, "whatever happens tomorrow, thank you." He looked up from his rifle, his grey eyes meeting hers in the moonlight. "Frank Peterson had a wife," he said, his voice quiet. "After he was killed, I couldn't face her. I just disappeared. I ran, helping you. This feels like I'm finally riding back in the right direction." Dawn came painting the eastern sky in shades of rose and gold, and with it a smudge of dust on the northern trail. "They're here," Cole said. His voice was calm, steady. Ilara took the baby and settled behind the largest boulder, her heart pounding a slow, heavy rhythm. This was it. The riders grew closer. There were 4 of them. Caleb Blackwood was in the lead, his posture rigid with anger. His 2 thugs from town flanked him, along with another B-Bar B rider. They were riding hard. Their horses lathered their faces grim with the frustration of a failed chase. They were exactly as Cole had predicted, arrogant, angry, and careless. They entered the narrow pass at the base of Sentinel Rock without even a scout. When they were directly below, Cole stood. He didn't fire. He simply stepped into view on the edge of the rock. "That's far enough, Blackwood," his voice boomed, echoing off the canyon walls. The riders pulled up sharply, their horses rearing in confusion. They stared up, shielding their eyes against the morning sun. "You!" Caleb snarled, recognizing the drifter from Harmony Creek. His face contorted with rage. "The doctor's office. That was you." "Where is she? Where is my brother's son?" "He's right here," Ilara said, stepping into view beside Cole, holding Thomas securely. "And he is my son." Caleb's eyes widened, first in shock, then in a cruel, predatory glee. They were trapped. Boxed in. "You damned fool," he laughed, pulling his pistol. "You led yourselves to your own execution. There's nowhere left to run." "We're not running," Cole said calmly, "and I'd advise you to put that pistol away." Crack! A puff of dust exploded from the rock, just inches from Caleb's head. The shot hadn't come from Cole. It came from a ledge, higher up and to the right. One of Caleb's thugs cried out and clutched his shoulder, his pistol tumbling from his grasp. Caleb and his men stared wildly. They were exposed, pinned down. Cole had spent half the night climbing to that secondary position, propping his Winchester on a secure ledge, aimed perfectly at the pass. He had tied a long piece of twine to the trigger. The other end of the twine was in his hand. He had turned the entire butte into a weapon. "The next one won't be a warning, Caleb," Cole shouted. "I have a document, a last will and confession, written and signed by your brother Thomas." Caleb's face went from rage to disbelief. "You're lying." "Am I?" Cole's voice was mocking. "He details everything the land grabs, the intimidation. He even writes about a Texas Ranger named Frank Peterson. Sound familiar? He names the men your father paid to arrange that riding accident, and he names you as the one who covered it up." The two remaining thugs exchanged nervous glances. This was not what they signed up for. They were hired muscle, not co-conspirators in the murder of a lawman. "He's bluffing!" Caleb screamed, but his voice lacked conviction. "He left everything to his wife and son." Cole pressed on his voice like a hammer blow. "This document makes Alara the owner of half the B-Bar B. It makes her son your boss, and it makes you and your father murderers. You drop your guns now, and I'll see this document gets to the federal marshal in Prescott. You force my hand, and it gets printed in every newspaper from here to Kansas City." It was a brilliant move. He had turned their greatest strength, the Blackwood name, into their greatest weakness. The threat wasn't death, it was exposure. Ruin. Caleb was trapped. His face was a mask of pure hatred. He looked at Alara, at the baby, at the man who had outsmarted him at every turn. In a final desperate act of rage, he raised his pistol not at Cole, but at Alara. But Cole was ready. He had been watching Caleb's eyes. He dropped the twine and drew his Colt in a single fluid motion that was terrifyingly fast. 2 shots cracked in the morning air, so close together they sounded like one. Caleb Blackwood staggered back, a look of stunned surprise on his face, a dark red stain blossoming on his chest. He collapsed to the ground, his pistol falling from his lifeless hand. Cole stood on the ledge, his own arm bleeding freely from a deep graze where Caleb's wild shot had torn through his sleeve. The remaining 2 men stared at their fallen leader, then up at the unassailable rock, then at each other. Without a word, they dropped their guns, raised their hands, and turned their horses around, fleeing back the way they came, wanting no more part in the Blackwood family's damnation. Silence descended on the pass, broken only by the whistling of the wind. It was over. Cole sank to one knee, the adrenaline leaving him, the pain in his arm flaring. Alara rushed to his side, tearing a strip from her petticoat to bandage the wound. "It's done," he breathed, looking at the bodies below. "It's finally done." Alara looked from his bleeding arm to her sleeping son, then out at the vast open land stretching before them. The sun was fully up now, bathing the world in a clean golden light. It was a world that for the first time looked not like a place to run from, but a place to build a life. She looked at the quiet, haunted man who had wrapped her in his coat during a thunderstorm and ended up wrapping her life in his courage. They were 2 broken people who had together found a way to be whole. They had faced the storm, the chase, and the shadow of death, and had walked out into the dawn. With the locket's secret in their possession, they held more than just their lives in their hands. They held the future. And so in the quiet aftermath of a battle fought not just with bullets, but with truth, a new day began for Alara Hayes and her son. They rode away from Sentinel Rock, not as fugitives, but as founders of a new future, leaving the shadows of the Blackwood Empire to crumble into dust behind them. The drifting cowboy Cole, who sought only to escape his ghosts, found his redemption in protecting a life he never expected to find. Their story is a testament to the fact that even in the most brutal and unforgiving of lands, courage can take root, and that the fiercest storms often come to wash the world clean, making way for a new dawn. They were a family forged in fire, fear, and faith, a reminder that the most precious things in life aren't what you own, but what you fight to protect. If this story of courage, survival, and redemption stirred your soul, help us keep these tales of the West alive. Hit that like button, share this story with someone who appreciates a real drama, and most importantly, subscribe to our channel for more stories from the frontier. Let us know in the comments what part of Elara and Cole's journey moved you the most. Thank you for listening.